In the small Ethiopian town of Axum, 200 kilometers south of Asmara, stands the Church of St. Mary of Zion. From the outside, it is not particularly remarkable. Whitewashed walls, a dome, a few palm trees around the perimeter. But entry to its central building is closed to the entire world. No one can enter, not a journalist, not a scientist, not even a prelate of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church itself. Only one person in the world has this right. The guardian monk, who was chosen when still young, settled within the church enclosure, and has never left it since. When he dies, he himself chooses a successor and passes on what he guards. According to Ethiopian clergy, this has continued for many centuries. What exactly is kept there is officially unknown. But the guardians themselves and the leadership of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church have asserted the same thing for centuries. Inside is the Ark of the Covenant. That same chest made of acacia wood and gold, crafted in the Sinai Desert over 3,000 years ago. The one that disappeared from the Jerusalem temple around the 6th century BCE and has not been recorded in any reliable source since. But here's the second mystery, which is no less intriguing than the first. 200 years ago, when European researchers first began systematically studying biblical descriptions of the Ark, they noticed something unexpected. Its construction, a layer of gold, then a layer of wood, then another layer of gold, exactly reproduced a structure that physicists of the 19th century were only beginning to intentionally create. A capacitor, a device for accumulating electrical charge. Gold conducts electricity. Wood insulates. Gold conducts again. This is not a metaphor or a coincidence in interpretation. It is a literal description of the construction recorded in the book of Exodus. What does this mean? Was the Ark a physical device with real electrical properties? Or is it simply a coincidence of geometry? And why, according to several independent biblical sources, did touching it lead to instant death? In this video, we will examine what exactly the biblical texts say about the construction, contents, and use of the Ark of the Covenant. Consider what history says about its fate and disappearance, and assess how substantiated the three main theories about where it might be today are. We will trace the sources, from the book of Exodus to medieval chronicles and materials from modern archaeological research, and try to separate documented facts from later accretions. Let's start at the very beginning, with how this artifact came to be and who made it. According to the book of Exodus, the command to create the ark was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, during the same period when the laws and statutes that became the foundation of Israelite religious life were delivered. The description of the ark is contained in the 25th chapter of the book of Exodus, and it is unusual for its specificity. Most religious texts give symbolic descriptions, allowing a wide range of interpretations. Here, there are precise dimensions, precise materials, a precise order of assembly. The length of the ark is 2.5 cubits. Its width and height are 1.5 cubits each. The cubit in different measurement systems of the ancient Near East varied from 44 to 53 centimeters, but the most common royal Egyptian cubit was about 52 centimeters. Using this as a basis, we get approximately 130 by 78 by 78 centimeters. This is an object comparable in size to a large chest or a small sarcophagus. The first material is acacia wood, in Hebrew, shittim. Acacia is one of the few trees that actually grows in the Sinai Desert and the Negev regions. Its wood is exceptionally hard, dense, and resistant to rot, making it an ideal material for an object that would be carried for decades in hot, dry conditions. The Egyptians themselves actively used acacia for making ritual and valuable items. The second material is gold. The ark was to be covered with gold inside and outside, and over it, a gold crown molding was to be cast around the entire perimeter of the top edge. The amount of gold required to fulfill this instruction was considerable. Given the size of the chest, the total area of all surfaces to be gilded amounted to several square meters. Where did slaves who had just left Egypt get the necessary amount of gold? The book of Exodus describes the following scene. Shortly before the Exodus, the Israelites asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and clothing. According to the text, the Egyptians gave them. Biblical commentary qualifies this not as theft, but as compensation for centuries of forced labor without reward. When Moses later announced a collection of donations for building the tabernacle and the ark, the people brought so much that a special order had to be issued to stop bringing gifts, as more material had accumulated than was needed. Who directly made the ark? The book of Exodus gives a specific name: Bezalel, son of Uri, of the tribe of Judah. This is an important detail. Bezalel is mentioned as the first person in the Bible about whom it is said that he was filled with the Spirit of God, but not for prophetic service or military leadership, but precisely for craft skill. The text lists his abilities: working with gold, silver, and copper, carving stone, working with wood. Alongside him worked Oholiab of the tribe of Dan. This description is interesting from a historical perspective. The Israelites indeed lived in Egypt for several generations, and some of them inevitably acquired the craft skills of Egyptian masters. Egyptians of the New Kingdom era, approximately the 16th to 11th centuries BCE, were among the best metalworkers in the ancient world. Their gold items found in tomb excavations demonstrate a technical level that European crafts surpassed only in the Middle Ages. It is quite possible that Bezalel, raised in an Egyptian environment, possessed precisely these techniques. The technology of applying gold to a wooden base used in Egypt is well known from archaeological finds. The craftsman hammered gold into thin sheets, flexible enough to tightly cover the surface, but not so thin that they would tear at the slightest touch. The sheets were attached to the wood using tiny gold nails, or natural resins acting as glue. Every centimeter of the surface had to be covered without a single gap. After finishing the sheathing of the chest, Bezalel proceeded to make the lid. It apparently was the most technically and theologically significant part of the entire object. The lid is called in Hebrew kaparet, a word derived from a root meaning to cover or to atone. In the synodal translation of the Bible, it is rendered as lid or mercy seat. The lid was to be made of solid gold, not from gold foil on a wooden base, but from solid metal. On its two ends, two figures, cherubim, were to be cast. They were to stand facing each other, heads bowed down, and stretch their wings so that they met over the space between them. What are cherubim in biblical tradition? They are not the plump-cheeked, winged infants we know from medieval painting. In ancient Hebrew tradition, a cherub is a creature of a fundamentally different kind, stemming from the image of the kerubu in Near Eastern iconography. A winged creature with the body of an animal, the face of a human or lion, and eagle wings. Similar figures guarded the entrances to Assyrian palaces and Egyptian sanctuaries. In the book of Genesis, cherubim guard the path to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. The space between the two gold figures, above the lid of the ark, is designated in the text as the place where God will appear and speak. This place is called Between the Two Cherubim. Here, several 20th century researchers noted the physical analogy we already mentioned. Two gold conductors, separated by a layer of wood insulator, and again surrounded by gold. This is the structure of a capacitor. The pointed wings of the two figures form points from which electrostatic charge discharge could occur, similar to discharge points in electrical devices. If the ark, during transport through the dry desert, accumulated static charge from friction of the coverings against the air and the carrying poles, then a person touching it with a different charge could theoretically cause a strong electrical discharge. This hypothesis was first formulated in popular form in the 70s of the 20th century and has since been repeatedly discussed both in popular literature and in specialized publications. The main objection against it is as follows. To accumulate a life-threatening charge requires very low air humidity and very specific friction conditions. In the conditions of an open desert with variable temperature and inconsistent humidity, controlled accumulation of charge on such a scale seems physically problematic. Nevertheless, the hypothesis is interesting not as an explanation for the death of people touching the ark, but as evidence that the creators of this object, consciously or not, chose a construction that, under certain physical conditions, would have unusual properties. Whether this was an accidental result of following religious prescriptions or something else is an open question. Let's move on to what was inside the ark. 3 items placed in it are known from different biblical sources, which describe them independently. The first and main one is the stone tablets, those same slabs on which the 10 Commandments were written. The book of Deuteronomy directly states, "Then I turned and came down from the mountain and put the tablets in the ark which I had made." An important detail here. The tablets stored in the ark were not the first ones made on Sinai. When Moses descended from the mountain the first time, according to the text, holding slabs with the freshly written law, he saw it dancing around a golden calf at the foot of the mountain. His reaction was immediate and physical. He threw the tablets to the ground, and they shattered. This was not an accident or anger clouding his mind. The shattered tablets had a specific symbolic meaning. The covenant that the people had already broken at the very moment Moses was carrying it in his hands was torn even before it could be accepted. A new ascent to the mountain, new making of tablets, new writing of commandments were required. These second tablets were placed in the ark. The second item is Aaron's staff. Its story is recorded in the 17th chapter of the book of Numbers. When some Israelites contested Aaron's right to the priesthood, God proposed a test. A staff from each tribe is taken. All 12 are placed in the tabernacle overnight. In the morning, the staff whose owner is chosen by God will blossom. In the morning, 11 staffs remained as they were in the evening, dry branches. Aaron's staff sprouted leaves, blossomed, and bore ripe almond fruits. A wooden rod that sprouted, lying all night in a closed room, an object that was to become evidence of Aaron's selection for all future times. The third item is a jar of manna. Manna was the food that, according to the text of the book of Exodus, appeared every morning on the ground around the Israelite camp throughout the 40 years of wandering. It could not be stored until the next day, it spoiled and bred worms. However, a small amount of it was placed in a golden jar and set before the ark, or, according to other instructions, inside it, as evidence of what had happened. The three items together form something like historical evidence: the tablets of the law received on Sinai, the staff of priestly election, the manna of sustenance in the desert. The ark was not just a ritual object, but also a repository of memory about key events that shaped the identity of the people. Now, about the rules for handling the ark. Here, biblical texts show particular care, and here, violation of the described rules invariably led to tragic consequences. The ark could not be moved like an ordinary object. For its transport, gold rings were inserted into it, 2 on each side, through which poles of acacia wood, also covered with gold, were passed. The 35th chapter of the book of Exodus specifically stipulates, the poles are not to be removed from the rings. They must remain there permanently, so that at any moment when the ark needs to be moved, there is no need to touch it. Only Levites from the family of Kohath were permitted to carry the ark. But even for them, this rite was conditional on observing a whole series of ritual requirements. The 4th chapter of the book of Numbers lists the order of preparation for transport. First, Aaron's priests had to enter the Holy of Holies and wrap the ark in special coverings, first in the veil, then in a tahash skin, then in a cloth of pure blue linen. Only after this could the Levites take the poles and lift it. Directly touching the ark, even through the veil, was forbidden to the Levites. The 4th chapter directly warns, they must not come in to watch while the holy things are being covered, lest they die. This regulation seems excessive until one reads the story that occurred several centuries later under King David. David decided to move the ark to Jerusalem, which had become his new capital. This was a politically and religiously significant act to unite the religious center of the country with the political one. The ark at that time was in the house of Abinadab on the hill, and David ordered it to be transported, but the method of transport was chosen incorrectly. Instead of carrying it on poles as prescribed, it was placed on a new cart pulled by oxen. The 16th chapter of the 1st book of Chronicles describes the journey. Everything went well until a place called the threshing floor of Chidon. Here the oxen stumbled, the cart tilted. A man named Uzzah nearby, apparently one of Abinadab's sons, accustomed from childhood to the ark's proximity, instinctively reached out his hand to steady the ark and fell dead. The biblical text is brief. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, without explanation. David, in fear, halted the transfer, and the ark was placed in the nearest house of the Levite Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months. Then the transfer was resumed, but now in the correct manner. Levites carried the ark on poles, and this time there were no incidents. For those inclined toward a physical explanation for people dying from contact with the ark, there is a notable detail in this episode. When carried on poles, through the people holding the poles, accumulated charge would gradually drain into the ground through the carriers' bodies, not creating dangerous voltage. When transported on a cart, insulated from the ground by wooden wheels, this draining did not occur. Charge accumulated. When a person standing on the ground touched the ark, the potential difference was maximum. An interesting mechanical hypothesis, although, strictly speaking, to confirm it, One needs to know the actual electrical characteristics of specific materials in specific climatic conditions, which we do not possess. The next important episode in the Ark's history is its capture. It occupies a special place precisely because it gives us a perspective quite rare in the Bible, a view of the Ark through the eyes of those who were not Israelites. The 4th and 5th chapters of the first book of Samuel describe the battle at Aphek, in which the Israelites suffered a cruel defeat from the Philistines. After the first day of battle, when losses were great, Israelite commanders decided to bring the Ark from Shiloh to the camp. The logic was obvious. If God is physically present among the army, victory is assured. But the logic did not work. The next day, the Israelites again suffered defeat, and a crushing one. 30,000 killed, and the Ark itself was captured. 2 sons of the high priest Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, who carried the Ark into battle, died. When the news reached Eli, sitting at the gates and waiting, he fell and broke his neck. His daughter-in-law, Phinehas's wife, was pregnant at that time. She gave birth to a boy and named him Ichabod, meaning no glory, or the glory has departed from Israel. Meanwhile, the Philistines took the Ark to their main religious center, Ashdod, and placed it in the temple of their main god, Dagon. The next morning, priests found the statue of Dagon lying face down before the Ark. They set it back. The next morning it was again lying, and this time its head and hands were broken off. This is one of the rare places in the Bible where humor, if not declared, is clearly implied. The victors placed the trophy next to their main god, and the trophy laid the god prostrate. But irony was accompanied by more serious problems. Diseases fell upon the inhabitants of Ashdod and surrounding cities. The biblical text describes tumors, which a number of commentators interpret as bubonic plague. The Philistines transported the Ark from city to city, from Ashdod to Gath, from Gath to Ekron, and disease and death followed it. Ultimately, the Philistines decided to return the Ark. They consulted priests and diviners, and they recommended the following. Place the Ark on a new cart, along with golden images, 5 tumors and 5 mice, according to the number of the 5 Philistine city-states, and harness 2 milk cows to the cart that had never been harnessed. The cows, having no habit of pulling a cart, and instinctively wanted to return to their calves, were to choose the road themselves. If they went toward Israelite land, then all misfortune came from the God of Israel. If they turned aside, it was a coincidence. The cows went straight along the road to Beth Shemesh, not turning right or left. The inhabitants of Beth Shemesh met the Ark with joy. But here, too, tragedy did not pass. Several people, according to the text, looked inside the Ark and died. Later rabbinic commentaries long discussed this episode, differing in interpretations, whether the punishment was for looking, or for how they looked, or for the general state of impurity of those who looked. After this, the Ark was moved to Kiriath Jearim, to the house of Abinadab, and remained there about 20 years until the episode with David described above. Now let's focus on one of the most detailed rituals described in the Bible related to the Ark, the Day of Atonement. The 16th chapter of the book of Leviticus describes an annual ritual that the high priest performed in a special room of the tabernacle called the Holy of Holies, or Kodesh Kodashim. There, behind a double veil separating this place from the rest of the tabernacle space, stood the Ark. No one except the high priest could enter there. The high priest himself only once a year on a specially appointed day called Yom Kippur. Preparation for this ritual took a week. The high priest separated from his family, moved to special quarters inside the temple buildings. Daily ablutions, constant memorization of the ritual order. On the day itself, he performed a complete ablution, dressed not in ordinary high priestly garments with a breastplate adorned with 12 precious stones, but in simple white linen garments, without any gold ornaments. Why precisely without gold is the subject of centuries-long discussion. Traditional explanation indicates that gold reminds him of the golden calf, and its presence is unsuitable for the moment of greatest closeness to God. Before entering the Holy of Holies, the high priest performed a sacrifice, a bull for his own sin and the sin of his family. Then he took a censer with burning coals and 2 handfuls of fragrant incense crushed into fine powder. This mixture was strictly regulated. The Lord, through Moses, warned that incense prepared differently than prescribed would bring death. Entering inside, he placed the censer between himself and the ark so that a cloud of fragrant smoke covered the lid of the ark. According to the description in the text, precisely this cloud of smoke served as a kind of screen between the man and what was above the lid of the ark, so that he would not die. Then, taking the blood of the sacrificial bull, he sprinkled it on the lid, on the east side, 7 times. After this followed the sacrifice of a goat for the sins of the people, and the same sprinkling procedure, again 7 times with the goat's blood. Then, sprinkling blood on the veils and walls of the inner room. All this, according to the text, cleansed the sanctuary from the impurity of the sons of Israel for the coming year. The total time the high priest spent in the Holy of Holies was not long. According to later commentators, it was a matter of minutes. But precisely this short presence became the central ritual of the Israelite liturgical calendar. Everything else in the year was preparation for it, or reflection of it. Parallelly, another action occurred, which many know under the name scapegoat. The second goat, which was not sacrificed, was brought to the high priest. He placed both hands on its head and confessed over it all the sins of the Israelite people. After this, the goat was led into the wilderness, into an inaccessible land, by a specially appointed man. This ritual of placing guilt on an animal and sending it away is one of the oldest symbolic gestures in human religious history, known in similar forms in several cultures of the ancient Near East. Let's note an important detail. This entire grand ritual was built around the single object standing in the Holy of Holies, the Ark. Precisely over its lid, blood was sprinkled. Precisely toward it, incense was directed. Precisely before it, the high priest's words were spoken. The Ark in this system was not just a religious symbol. It was a point of contact between man and what was described as the presence of God. This ritual was performed for hundreds of years, from the Sinai era to the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. And precisely in this year, the Ark disappeared. The Babylonian army of Nebuchadnezzar II took Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took to Babylon everything of value. The 4th and 25th chapters of the 4th book of Kings contain detailed lists of items taken by the Babylonians from the temple. Gold and silver vessels, censers, bowls, basins, dishes, lamps, spoons, incense burners. Listed are pots, shovels, tongs, sprinkling bowls, censers, basins, pots. But the Ark is not mentioned in these lists. Not once. This silence itself is eloquent. The Babylonians were meticulous accountants of their military trophies. They recorded everything. If they had taken from the temple an object the size of a large chest, covered with gold, weighing by approximate estimates over 100 kilograms, it would have been recorded. It is not in the lists. This absence gives rise to three theories, each with its supporters and its evidence, or lack thereof. The first theory: the ark was destroyed by the Babylonians, burned together with the temple, and the gold melted. This is technically possible, but poorly fits what we know about Babylonian practice. They did not melt trophies on site. They transported them to Babylon. Gold removed from the wooden base of the ark could have been melted and thus not entered the inventory as a separate item. But the wood, stone tablets, and other contents should have left some trace. There are no direct witnesses to this theory. The second theory: the ark was hidden shortly before the Babylonian invasion. Some prophetic texts, particularly the book of the prophet Jeremiah, mention that high priests and scribes hid sacred items beforehand. The second book of Maccabees, written much later, in the 1st or 2nd century BCE, contains a direct indication. Jeremiah, by God's command, hid the tabernacle and the ark in a cave on the mountain from which Moses saw Canaan. This mountain is not named specifically, but it is commonly believed to be Mount Nebo in Transjordan. Under Jerusalem, there is an extensive system of underground tunnels and chambers, some dating to the First Temple era. Excavations in the area of the Western Wall, particularly intensive since the 60s of the 20th century, indeed revealed a number of sealed passages going under the Temple Mount. Access to them is limited for political and religious reasons. The Israeli side cannot conduct excavations in areas under the management of the Waqf, the Muslim religious trust. These restrictions apparently will remain indefinitely. In this region of the globe, political and religious interests are intertwined so tightly that independent scientific research is practically impossible. In 1981, Israeli Rabbi Yehuda Getz, engaged in excavations of tunnels near the Western Wall, reported that he had discovered a passage leading under the Temple Mount. According to him, he was convinced that the ark was there. Work was immediately stopped after protests from Muslim authorities, and the discovered passage was filled with concrete. The third theory, the very one with which we began this story. According to Ethiopian tradition, the ark was taken from Jerusalem much earlier, not in the 6th century BCE, but approximately in the 10th, still during the lifetime of King Solomon. It was taken by Menelik, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, during his mother's visit to Jerusalem. According to this version, the young man secretly replaced the ark with a copy and took the genuine one to Ethiopia. Solomon, learning of this, did not return his son, allowed him to leave. This story is recorded in the Kebra Nagast, an Ethiopian medieval text literally meaning "glory of the kings." This text, translated from an Arabic original, is presumably written at the end of the 1st millennium or beginning of the 2nd. It is an official document justifying the sacred legitimacy of the Ethiopian imperial dynasty. Ethiopian kings considered themselves direct descendants of Solomon through Menelik. If we accept the chronology of this theory, then the ark was not there when the Babylonians entered the Holy of Holies, and precisely therefore it is not in the list of items taken. Objections against the Ethiopian version are obvious. Biblical texts, including descriptions of Yom Kippur rituals, and the story with Uzzah, assume the ark's presence in Jerusalem after Solomon's presumed reign. In the era of prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, during the reforms of King Josiah. The ark's absence at this time would almost certainly have been recorded. None of these sources mentions its disappearance. Nevertheless, there is no consensus among serious researchers. Some historians continue to consider the Ethiopian tradition a late legendary formation without historical basis. Others believe it may contain a historical core, possibly related to the transfer to Ethiopia not of the ark itself, but of its copy or a related ritual object. The fact that the church in Aksum indeed guards something in an unusual manner, with the institution of a lifelong guardian who never leaves the church enclosure, is not proof by itself, but it indicates that the stored item is perceived as something exceptional. What exactly is there? Science currently has no way to establish. There is another page in the history of searches for the Ark, a dark page, and in its own way, indicative. In the 30s of the 20th century, German Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler sent special expeditions to several regions of Europe and the Near East with the task of finding items that Nazi ideology classified as power artifacts. Among them was the Ark of the Covenant. One direction of search was the French castle Montségur in the Pyrenees, once associated with the Cathar movement. According to a version held by some Nazi occultists, Knights Templar during the Crusades could have taken from Jerusalem and hidden in Europe a number of sacred items, including the Ark. The expeditions spent several months, found nothing, and returned empty-handed. The episode itself is notable, not as evidence of the Ark's location, it certainly wasn't there, but as an indicator of how much this story stirred the imagination of people of various eras and convictions. The Ark, regardless of the physical reality it represents, became in cultural imagination a symbol of absolute power. Precisely therefore it appeared in Steven Spielberg's film Raiders of the Lost Ark, released in 1981. There, Nazis also search for the Ark, also fail to handle it, and in the end are literally destroyed by its power. The film is made as an adventure, but the intuition that generated it is rooted in real history. So what do we ultimately know about the Ark of the Covenant from the perspective of history and archaeology? We know the following. The technology for making such an item, a wooden chest covered with gold sheets with a gold lid and figures on it, was quite achievable for Bronze Age craftsmen trained in Egyptian techniques. No miraculous or modern craftsmanship was required for this. Similar items were discovered in tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. We know that the Ark, over several centuries, indeed was the center of Israelite worship, and its physical movement was connected with the most important events, military campaigns, rituals, political decisions. We know that after the destruction of the first temple in the 6th century BCE, it ceases to be mentioned in sources. During the construction of the second temple, completed around 516 BCE, the Holy of Holies was empty, which itself was acknowledged and recorded in text. The high priest entered there on Yom Kippur, but there was nothing there. This fact is unanimously recognized by all researchers. Where exactly the Ark is now, or whether it was destroyed or is stored somewhere inaccessible to science, is reliably unknown. 3 theories remain open. None has been definitively refuted. None has been proven. This itself is notable, an item associated with hundreds of textual mentions, thousands of years of ritual life, many deaths and great battles, simply disappears from history at some point. No traces, no records, neither among the victors nor the vanquished. Precisely this disappearance, not the ark itself, but its absence, became perhaps its most mysterious part. An item that was at the center of civilization for half a millennium disappeared as quietly as if it dissolved. And in Aksum, a person still carries out his indefinite duty, whom no one can forcibly replace until he himself chooses a successor. What he guards remains unknown. It is only known that he will not stop guarding it. The history of the Ark of the Covenant is not only the history of a religious object. It is the history of how around one artifact, a system of rituals, laws, fears, and hopes formed, which defined the life of an entire people for centuries. And the history of how the greatest mysteries sometimes have no solution, not because the answer is deliberately hidden, but simply because history is structured that way. It leaves gaps that can be looked into endlessly. Before moving to the final part, it is worth considering several aspects that rarely come to the center of attention when telling about this object, but significantly enrich the picture. The first of them is comparative. The Ark of the Covenant was not a unique phenomenon in the religious space of the ancient Near East. The practice of storing sacred items in closed boxes or chests was widespread among many peoples of this region. In Egypt, there were so-called gods' barks, processional stretchers on which statues of gods were carried during religious holidays. They were arranged similarly: wooden base covered with gold, poles for carrying. The priesthood of Amun in Karnak carried out the bark of god Amun during annual festivals, and its passage through the crowd was perceived as the literal presence of God among people. This parallel has long attracted researchers' attention. Among the Hittites, a powerful people of Asia Minor, contemporaries of Egyptians and Israelites, there were ritual items that were taken on campaigns with the army, in which, according to Hittite beliefs, physically embodied the presence of the patron god in battle. Without these items, Hittite military campaigns were considered spiritually unprotected. Thus, the idea of the ark as a physical container of God's presence fits into the broad religious context of its era. This does not mean that the Ark of the Covenant was simply a copy of an Egyptian god's bark. Constructive and theological differences are quite significant, but it allows us to understand that Bezalel and his contemporaries worked within a religious culture where the idea of God's physical presence in a specific object was not exotic, but part of the common religious language. What distinguished the Israelite ark from analogs? First of all, the absence of an image. In Egyptian barks, statues of gods were transported. In Hittite processions, figures or symbols. The ark was empty. Inside it were stored items, tablets, staff, jar of manna, but not an image. Above it, a lid with 2 cherubim, but the cherubim themselves served not as statues of God, but as something like a throne or footstool. The place itself between the cherubim, above the lid, was empty, and yet considered the place of presence. This constructive emptiness was fundamental. Depiction of God was categorically forbidden in Israelite tradition. The second of the 10 Commandments: you shall not make for yourself an idol or any image of what is in heaven above or on earth below. The ark was a device for God's presence, without attempting to visualize this presence. The second aspect deserving attention is the theological significance of the propitiatorium, the lid of the ark, in subsequent religious thought. In the Greek version of the Bible, the Septuagint, translated in the 3rd-2nd centuries BCE. The lid of the ark is denoted by the word hilasterion. In the New Testament, this same word is used in the Epistle to Romans in the 4th chapter regarding Jesus Christ. God presented him as a propitiation. For authors of early Christian thought, the ark became a prototype. What happened over its lid on Yom Kippur, sprinkling blood of a sacrificial animal for cleansing the sins of the people, was perceived as a prototype of what, according to their faith, occurred in another form in the New Testament time. This echoing of meanings is also traced in how the Epistle to Hebrews, another New Testament text, describes high priestly service. The 9th chapter of this epistle reproduces a detailed description of Yom Kippur, the furnishings of the tabernacle, chambers, ark, veil, sprinkling of blood, and builds theological argumentation on this basis. The author of the epistle clearly expected an audience thoroughly familiar with the details of the ritual. This itself indicates that the tradition of describing the ark and related rituals was alive and transmitted in detail from generation to generation, even after the ark itself disappeared. In the Second Temple, there was no ark, but the Yom Kippur ritual was performed, in a somewhat altered form, without the object it was originally directed toward. Where the ark once stood, there was simply a stone called Even HaShetiyah, the foundation stone. On it, blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled on the Day of Atonement. The stone replaced the object that disappeared. The third aspect is material traces of ark-like items in archaeology. During excavations in Palestine and adjacent regions, researchers discovered several items that were qualified as possible analogs or imitations of the ark. One of the most famous such items is a small model found in Capernaum, a synagogue facade with an image of a cart carrying a chest, crowned with 2 figures. This relief, dated to the 2nd-3rd century CE, reproduces the iconography of the ark already in an era when the object itself long did not exist, evidence of how its image lived in collective memory. In Egyptian tombs, primarily in the tomb of Tutankhamun, opened in 1922, ritual chests were found arranged similarly to the description of the ark. Wooden base covered with gold, with poles for carrying, and with figures placed on the lid. These finds gave invaluable material for understanding how the Ark of the Covenant might have looked. Masters familiar with Egyptian techniques could quite create a similar item. The fourth aspect is the history that remains off-screen. It is the history of those who carried the ark. Levites from the family of Kohath. We know very little about them as people. Several episodes in the book of Numbers depict them as those who were closest to this object, and yet exposed to the greatest danger. The 4th chapter describes their service. They dealt with carrying the ark itself and other sacred items, while other Levite families carried heavier but less dangerous duties, transporting beams, pillars, veils. In Numbers, it was clearly delineated. Carriers of the ark did not see the object itself at the moment of packing. They came when everything was already wrapped. Looking at the ark without permission was not allowed for them. One of the warnings sounds strikingly unambiguous. Aaron and his sons shall go in and assign each to his service and his burden. But they shall not go in to look at the holy things, even for a moment, lest they die. This means that Levites from the family of Kohath carried on their shoulders an object that could kill them without seeing it. They knew about it only by rules: what is permitted, what is forbidden, how to hold the poles, how to step in unison. Such organization, built on precise following of instruction, without full understanding of the nature of the object, is in some sense one of the earliest forms in history of working with dangerous materials. The fifth aspect, rarely discussed, is the question of the authenticity of the contents of the tablets. Among biblical scholars, a debate has long been ongoing about when exactly the Ten Commandments acquired their final form and by whom they were written. Conservative tradition insists on the Sinai revelation as a historical event. Critical biblical scholarship, formed in the 18th, 19th centuries, proposed versions of later editing and compilation of Pentateuch texts. What is notable? Two main variants of the Ten Commandments, in the 20th chapter of Exodus and the 5th chapter of Deuteronomy, have small textual differences. This itself is an argument in favor that we are not dealing with an exact copy from one original, but parallel traditions stemming from a common source, interpreted differently in different communities. Nevertheless, none of the scientific schools disputes the fact of the ark's existence as a real object in the era of the Israelite monarchy. Too many independent narrative sources, the story with Uzzah, the story with the Philistines, description of Yom Kippur rituals, the account of David's transfer, to consider it exclusively a literary image. The sixth aspect is the fate of the Ark in Islamic tradition. The Ark is present in Islamic narrative under the name Tabut al-Sakina, the chest of tranquility, or the box of security. It is mentioned in Surah al-Baqarah, the second surah of the Quran, in connection with the prophet Samuel, and the reign of Talut, Saul. And their prophet said to them, "The sign of his kingship is that the ark will come to you, in which is tranquility from your Lord, and remnants of what the family of Musa and the family of Harun left. Angels carry it. Indeed, in that is a sign for you, if you are believers." This Quranic passage is notable because, firstly, it acknowledges the reality of the ark as a historical object. Secondly, attributes to it the quality of sakina, tranquility or divine presence. And thirdly, contains a detail about carrying by angels, which is not in the Hebrew Bible. This indicates that in the Arab environment of the 7th century CE, there existed an oral tradition about this object, partially coinciding with the biblical, partially developing independently. It is also interesting that precisely the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the place where Solomon's temple stood, and thus the Ark, is the third most significant shrine in Islam after Mecca and Medina. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are built precisely there. This religious significance of the place was inherited by Islam from Judaism and largely determines today's impossibility of scientific excavations. Thus, the mystery of the Ark is not only a scientific or archaeological problem. It is a problem of political geography, in which religious interests of three world traditions compete for one plot of land of several hundred square meters. The seventh aspect is the physical characteristics of the Ark and modern reconstructions. In the 20th century, several engineers and enthusiasts of ancient history attempted to build a functional replica of the Ark based on the description in the book of Exodus. All encountered the same thing. The description is detailed, but incomplete. The text gives dimensions, indicates materials, describes the form of cherubim in general terms, but does not describe the method of attaching gold to wood, the shape of the rings for poles, the exact appearance of cherubim figures. These gaps must be filled by interpretation. The most thorough of documented reconstructions was created by Israeli craftsmen for the needs of the Jerusalem Temple Institute, an organization engaged in practical preparation for the possible restoration of the Third Temple. Their replica, made with maximum approximation to biblical descriptions, gives a good idea of what the Ark might have looked like visually. It is kept in a special room of the organization and accessible for visitors to view. The calculated mass of the replica was about 150 kilograms. This means that 4 Levites, carrying the Ark on poles, 2 on each side, carried 75 kilograms plus the weight of the poles themselves. This is heavy, but feasible. Moving with such a load in step with other people, never stumbling on uneven desert or city roads, this already required significant physical preparation and daily training. Precisely the physical heaviness of the Ark may partially explain another biblical episode, less known than the story with Uzzah. In the period of Judges, when Israelites carried the Ark into battle against the Philistines at Aphek, it is unknown how exactly they carried it. The text mentions that they took it. If in the haste of military assembly the rules of transport were violated, there were no prepared Levite carriers, proper ritual purity was not observed, the Ark was carried incorrectly. This could be precisely the violation that, according to biblical logic, doomed the campaign to failure. The final moment in our discussion of the Ark is the question of its significance outside religious context. The Ark of the Covenant occupies a special place in the history of human culture, not only because it is a religious shrine for millions of people. It occupies this place because it is one of the most detailed described items of material culture from the entire Bronze and early Iron Age, and yet physically undiscovered. In the world, there are thousands of artifacts of ancient civilizations, pots, jewelry, statues, tools. All are silent about themselves and speak only when a researcher asks them questions. The Ark is the opposite object. It continues to speak about itself through texts for 3,000 years, but it itself is absent. This unique relationship between documentary trace and physical absence makes it, perhaps, the most discussed disappeared object in world history. And this discussion does not fade, because it has no resolution. While in Aksum, a guardian performs his service, whom no one can forcibly replace, unlike his predecessors, while under the Temple Mount lie unexcavated chambers, while researchers argue about the exact meaning of Egyptian inscriptions and Aramaic papyri, the history of the Ark remains unresolved. Perhaps that is how it should be. Some mysteries are not solved. They live. And precisely this living existence over millennia is, perhaps, the most interesting thing about them.